Quote, "You failed to mention that the reason blacks are behaving this way is because Jews have brainwashed blacks that white people are the cause of all their problems." End quote. This was a comment that a viewer posted to one of my videos, and I've gotten several along these lines over the past several months, to the effect of whatever issue I raise or whatever point I'm trying to make, I'm somehow missing the fact that it's all rooted in the incredible power of the Jewish influence. And I get lots of messages from people telling me that I should go watch David Duke's videos. Well, the reason why I don't make the arguments about Jews that David Duke makes is not because I'm unfamiliar with his arguments, but because I think they are idiotic. David Duke's views on Jews are idiotic because they lead him to take absurd position in defense of radical Islamic, anti-American extremists such as Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, anyone who understood the principles underlying Western societies and Western freedoms would not embrace a character like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Duke takes a single issue that he has commonality with Ahmadinejad on, a single issue whose relevance to the majority of the American people and to Western people is trivial. And Duke says to Ahmadinejad, "You're my ally because you're opposed to Zionism and you're in favor of open debate on the question of the World War II genocide of the Jews." Talk about integrating based on non-essentials. Ahmadinejad does not advocate free speech on the Holocaust question because he is an advocate of free speech or freedom as such. He only advocates it because he thinks it will undermine Zionism. Iran is a highly oppressive country. The Iranian people are suffering under a fundamentalist Islamic regime that, next to Saudi Arabia, is probably the world's biggest exporter of hatred toward America. Time and time again, David Duke embraces, apologizes for, and supports radical Islam and the populations that espouse it. David Duke, in one of his recent videos, proclaimed, quote, "We're all Palestinians now." He said so because the Palestinians are supposedly under siege by Israel. These are the same Palestinians who jumped for joy upon hearing news of 9/11 and danced in the streets. It was one of the biggest celebrations in the Palestinian territory that they've probably ever seen. I'm not a fan of Israel and its actions and its influence on the United States, but the Palestinians are savages. I don't give a damn if Israel occupies their so-called territory. If the Palestinians are so beloved throughout the Arab world, then there is plenty of land available for them to go to where they should be welcomed with open arms. But I don't even want to get into the whole Israeli-Palestinian dispute. It's really not of great interest to me. It's an unhealthy obsession for David Duke and a lot of other people who believe in his particular ideology. His ideology is rooted in a particular sect of Christianity that views Jews as being bearing the face of the devil for having murdered Jesus Christ, and then David Duke obsesses over some bizarre passages in Judaic thought that allude to boiling Jesus in semen. And so Duke obsesses over these ancient religious conflicts. And other sects of Christianity obsess over Israel for completely different reasons. They believe that Israel has to be protected because it's paving the way for the second coming of Christ. The reality is that the West is being inundated not by Jews, but by Muslims. That is the main threat in Western Europe. But if your view of reality is entirely a conspiratorial mindset to where any problem you can identify, your response will be, well, that's only because there are Jews behind the scenes controlling the people who are making these decisions on immigration that make massive Muslim influx into Western Europe possible. It's very difficult to get through to somebody with a conspiratorial mindset, because no matter what you say and no matter what evidence you show them, they will always be of the opinion that, well, that may be true, but there's something going on behind the scenes that you're missing out on. And, you know, the people who try to excuse or rationalize the behavior of Islamic extremists by saying that they're animated by grievances against Jews, which they implicitly regard as justifiable grievances, this kind of thought is exactly the same kind of thought that the left employs with regard to every thing that blacks do, from lower academic performance to higher crime rates to higher out-of-wedlock pregnancies and higher levels of dysfunction generally. Well, they'll say that all these things are merely the result of racism on the part of whites. They'll even say that high instances of black-on-black violence is ultimately the result of white racism, because blacks were oppressed for so long that they have this rage and they're just responding to it. They're just blowing off steam. What else could they possibly do? They've been subjected to so much racism. And so this argument about Israeli and U.S. foreign policy inducing Islamic radicals to senselessly commit acts of terrorism targeting innocent people, they're just responding. And unfortunately, sometimes Ron Paul gets into this line of argument, trying to somehow rationalize what the radical Muslims are doing. And I have great respect for Ron Paul. I'm glad he's in the Congress. But when he gets into issues of foreign policy, all he wants to talk about is what the U.S. does that motivates them. And to some extent, he's correct that our aggressive foreign policy has engendered a higher level of hostility among Muslims toward the U.S. than would otherwise be the case. But that does not imply that if we were just a free, peaceful, non-interventionist country like we should be, that the Muslims still would not hate us simply for our freedoms. That aspect is a fundamental conflict between the two cultures, because the simple publishing of our cartoon depicting the Prophet Muhammad, right, or the simple burning of a book by some obscure pastor thousands of miles away incites Muslims into fanatical and violent behavior. So what do? Do we blame free speech? The fact that we had free speech for provoking Muslims, and if we just did away with free speech, that the Muslims would get along with us better? And look, back to the Jewish question. It seems absolutely absurd to me that the Jews would want massive Muslim immigration into Europe or anywhere. They would have certainly the leftist, multicultural, pseudo-Marxist Jews want that just as much as the same could be said for non-Jewish whites who are of that particular political viewpoint want that, because they are extreme altruists and they believe that it is noble to sacrifice oneself and one country to some sort of higher ideal of diversity. But I'm talking about Jews who are rationally self-interested. The Jews in places like Malmo, Sweden, are literally being violently uprooted by these masses of Muslim immigrants who come in there and they vandalize synagogues, they initiate verbal and physical attacks on random Jews that they see. They try to drive them out of neighborhoods, and they are succeeding in doing so. The Jewish groups, the so-called Jewish supremacist groups, are noting that anti-Semitic attacks are on the rise throughout much of Europe, and they're being fueled by Muslims. Rationally self-interested Jews and rationally self-interested Westerners have a common interest in protecting Western countries from being invaded by Muslims. And David Duke is an apologist not only for Muslims, not only for the religion of Islam, but for some of the most powerful and radical Muslim tyrants on the planet, such as Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. David Duke's orientation is not only immoral, in my view, but tactically it's going to be a disaster if advocates of Western preservation get lumped in with his Jewish conspiracy theories. It will lose all credibility to the side of those who simply advocate preservation and freedom in their own countries. And I think David Duke knows politically that it's a terrible tactic to be emphasizing the so-called Jewish supremacism that he obsesses over in a campaign for any kind of worthwhile political change that you could realistically implement. David Duke actually has, or at one time had, pretty good political skills. He managed to get a majority of the white vote when he ran for governor of Louisiana, and he ran under the slogan, "Equal rights for all, special rights for none." I don't think he ever mentioned any kind of Jewish conspiracies throughout his campaign, and at that time he disavowed his associations with the Ku Klux Klan. He presented himself as a sensible advocate for white equal rights. But unfortunately, I think he was insincere. I don't think what he campaigned on were his true beliefs. And now, later in life, he's decided to invest more heavily in his true beliefs, to the detriment, I believe, to the causes that he claims to be advancing, namely white survival and the survival of white nations. The anti-immigrant, pro-freedom parties that are making advances in Europe are those that are focused on stopping Muslim immigration, stopping their efforts to implement Sharia law. And I'm talking about people like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Now, how much support does Wilders' effort to prevent the Islamification of the Netherlands and of Europe have with David Duke? The answer is zero. David Duke has offered zero support to Wilders because he views him, apparently, because Wilders has some Jewish supporters, so therefore he's a Zionist, and his religious interests and obsessions over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict prevent him from coming to the moral aid of somebody who's trying to save Europe from Islamification. I'm going to go out on a limb here and speculate that if Adolf Hitler were around today, he would probably have a more sensible take on Europe's problems and the solutions that are needed in Europe than does David Duke. Now, I'm not a fan of Adolf Hitler. I think he was a disaster, and white nationalists who obsess over Jewish problems tend to be disasters, whereas whites, well, just look at the tremendous improvements in the standard of living that apartheid South Africa brought to the South African people of all races. South Africa was an ally of Israel and vice versa. But I've walked the streets of Frankfurt, I've walked the streets of Berlin, and I can't help but think that if Hitler were in my shoes today doing the same thing, that he wouldn't come to the conclusion that, you know, I really had a problem with Jewish influence and Jewish power back in the day. But now, I think we've really got to get a hold of this Islamic problem. I think that's probably a more pressing concern than anything about that I wrote about in Mein Kampf. So I think, you know, David Duke doesn't want to believe that whites are ultimately responsible for their own demise. And it would be so convenient to just have a small group of people that you could blame everything on. But you know what? If that small group of people suddenly vanished tomorrow, we would still be facing the same exact problems that we do in fact face now. Cultural Marxism would not recede into the dustbin of history, not without a fight to convince the people, many of whom are in fact white, that what they are advocating is suicidal and extremely evil. That's the argument, painful as it may be, that we have to make. Blaming things on the Jews will only diminish your credibility in the eyes of other whites, most sensible whites. They won't buy into it. They'll just dismiss you as a neo-Nazi. And it's unfortunate that that's what David Duke ultimately amounts to, because in much of his writings, in his book My Awakening, he had some really good, well-reasoned chapters on biological, scientifically proven differences among the races. But he tries to mix the science and the reality and the common sense with his overarching religious prerogatives and his conspiracy theories. I could make the argument that David Duke is just being used as a tool to discredit the whole idea of race realism and make it seem disreputable, because that's the effect he's having. I mean, how do all these Jewish supremacists manage to win so much sympathy and get so much power? By referring to the racist, bigoted enemies who are basically all these neo-Nazis. So it seems to me it would suit the Jewish supremacists pretty well to have enemies like David Duke they can point toward. And of course they do. David Duke and other so-called anti-Semites are all over the Anti-Defamation League's websites and other Jewish groups' websites. And let me make it clear, I'm against the ADL's political agenda. I'm against Jewish supremacism. I understand that Jews have outsized influence in government, in law, and in the media. There's no doubt about that. I'm also against black supremacism. I'm against Islamic supremacism. I'm against Mexican supremacism. There are a whole host of threats that are based on ethnic groups and their desire to wield power. Now, the Islamic supremacists have strength in numbers and strength in the fervor with which they believe in their cause. I mean, demographics are on their side. Their populations are exploding and expanding throughout the world, and the same cannot be said for Jews. The main weapon Jews have is the power of their words, and you have to believe that Jews are somehow so clever, so cunning, and so skilled with the way they use their words that they manage to transfix entire populations into being subservient to their agenda. And that's ridiculous. I mean, not all Jews are that genius. Not even a single Jew is that much of a genius. But I guess David Duke thinks they are. He thinks they have some kind of higher powers. They're smart, but they're not that smart. Nobody is. Moreover, even if Jews were so smart, they don't all have the same ideas. They're not a monolithic group as Muslims are or as black Americans are, that they all tend to think alike. I mean, they lean probably a little more to the left on most issues than the average white American does. But you find plenty of people of Jewish descent in libertarian circles and conservative circles, in the objectivist movement, which is completely opposed to cultural Marxism and all of its aims and all of its core premises. I think the establishment Jewish groups are in favor of such things as liberal immigration policies, hate crime laws, and other restrictions on free speech because of their memory of what happened in World War II. And that has really shaped so much of what Jews experience as the Jewish identity to this day. So there's some paranoia there, no doubt about that. But it's ultimately white people who provide the legislative votes and who sit in bureaucracies and preside over courts on the bench that implement particular aspects of the Jewish agenda, what David Duke would call the Jewish agenda, which really is an agenda that is adhered to by many more non-Jewish whites than Jews. If you just look at the pure numbers, I think what Adolf Hitler did and what happened in World War II really spooked a lot of Americans and scared them away from advocating or even being perceived to advocate any policy that would have similarities to eugenics or the exclusion or persecution of certain groups for any reason, because people fear that, well, that could lead to another Holocaust. And it's even a more sensitive issue in Europe. And that's why we have laws against free speech, laws against writing books that question certain aspects of the Holocaust. That's why people can be put in prison in Europe for so-called Holocaust denial, but they can't in the United States. They can, I think, in Canada also, but not in the United States. It's not because Jews exercise so much power in those areas, but not in the United States. It's due to cultural differences and different experiences and levels of sensitivities, however irrational they may be at this point. Well, I've already gone on way too long on this subject than I had intended to. So in closing, my message to all defenders of the West is this: if you follow the Geert Wilders model of ideological activism, we might have a chance of winning. If you follow the David Duke model, we surely will not.